afternoon, everybody. It's fantastic that we have so many people here. Before I introduce our speaker for today, I want to thank the members of the Latin American Studies program for their help in organizing this event, specifically Mariola Alvarez, Ben Fala, Patrice Franco, Jenny Gubner, Lindsay Maika, Jorge Olivares, Betty Sasaki, Winifred Tate, and Brent White. And I'd also like to extend a thank you to Kim Bard and Caroline Tiegler for helping with all the logistical events of this event, specifically making all the travel arrangements, all the coordinations that needs to happen in that beautiful poster to announce our talk today. So thank you all very much. So today I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Isar Godreau. Dr. Godreau studied at the University of Puerto Rico in Piedras, and she later obtained her PhD in cultural anthropology from the University of California, Santa Cruz. Currently, she works at the Institute for Interdisciplinary Research at the University of Puerto Rico at Calle, where she directs institution-level research initiatives as well as her own research projects. Her work explores issues of race, racism, and identity in Puerto Rico and the Caribbean. She's published on hair, racial terminology, and folklorization of Blackness, census, racial categories in Puerto Rico, and racism in the elementary school setting. She's the author of Arrancando mitos de raíz, Guía para la enseñanza antirracista de la herencia africana en Puerto Rico, or in English, Uprooting Myths, a guide for the anti-racist teaching of Puerto Ricans' African legacy, and the recently published Scripts of Blackness, Race, Cultural Nationalism, and U.S. Colonialism in Puerto Rico. And her talk today is entitled Benevolent Slavery and the Making of Hispanic Whiteness in Puerto Rico. So please join me in extending a warm welcome to Dr. Isar Godreau.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to see such a vibrant room full of people. And thanks to Rebecca A. Colon for the invitation, to Ben Fala from Latin American Studies, and to their team for bringing me here. So I've entitled Scripts of Blackness, Benevolent Slavery, and the Making of Hispanic Whiteness in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico has a population of approximately 3.5 million people. Now, intriguingly, census results for the island, most recent ones in 2010, reveal that an overwhelming majority of Puerto Ricans, that is 76%, identified as white only in the census. Intriguingly, these figures slightly surpass the number of people who identified as white in the U.S., which was 75%. So we have more white people in Puerto Rico than here in the U.S. Now, you might ask yourself, how is this possible in a Caribbean island? Scholars explain this tendency as one caused by the expansion of the definition of whiteness, which in turn stimulated by people's awareness of the privilege conferred to whiteness and by the desire to distance themselves from the social stigma associated with a black identity. Now, this trend is not exclusive to Puerto Rico. In the Hispanic Caribbean, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, this is expanded, more flexible definition of whiteness, what I call Hispanic whiteness, can encompass people with a wide array of phenotypic features, including people who will probably not be identified as white here in the U.S. And this, of course, points to the socially constructed nature of race as a category that is not fixed or biologically determined, but that is subject to interpretation across time and place. Caribbean historian Herbert Hutink, for example, argued that even during the 19th century, the ideal of phenotypic whiteness was much darker in the Hispanic Caribbean than in the English or French Caribbean. According to Hutink, people who belonged to the upper class and were identified as colored in the French or English colonies could be identified as white in the Spanish colonies, Puerto Rico, Cuba, or the DR. Now, in Puerto Rico, this flexible and heterogeneous construction of Hispanic whiteness operates alongside a very categorical, narrow, and stereotypical construction of the black subject. who is assigned specific phenotypic characteristics such as very dark skin color, white lips, nose shape, etc. In contrast to the United States, where the one-drop rule considers any person with African ancestry to be black, the system of race classification in the Hispanic Caribbean is often based on the opposite premise. That is, that black identity is diluted through mixture, and that race mixture actually increases the number of people who can identify as white, or at least as not black. Now, in this racialized stratified system in the Hispanic Caribbean, people then try to avoid blackness by negotiating degrees of whiteness through mixture, okay? A process that has also been known as blanqueamiento, or whitening. Now, in this presentation, I need to make 2 points. First, that such notion of Hispanic whiteness and blanqueamiento are mutually dependent on the construction of that very essentialized and narrowly defined notion of blackness. And second, that such constructions are facilitated by equally essentialized interpretations of the institution of slavery and of the slave subject. And since I am an anthropologist, I also want to give you an ethnographic sense of how these ideas about blackness, slavery, Hispanic whiteness, etc. have concrete repercussions for people on the ground. But before delving into the subject, let me make a parenthesis about, to tell you a little bit about Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is not a sovereign nation, but a commonwealth. Right there in the Caribbean, with the arrow. It was first a colony of Spain until 1898, and then Puerto Rico was occupied by the U.S. that same year during the course of the Cuban-Spanish-American War. So slavery then occurred during Spanish occupation, which lasted until 1898, and then the U.S. Acquired Puerto Rico, or invaded Puerto Rico. The U.S. acquisition of Puerto Rico from Spain marked an era in which the U.S. emerged as an imperial power in the world stage, drawing into its orbit other communities such as like the Philippines, Guam, American Samoa, U.S. Virgin Islands, Hawaii, that pose complex legal, economic, and social challenges. Puerto Ricans, for example, have been U.S. citizens since 1917. My passport is U.S. passport. Yet island dwellers cannot vote in U.S. presidential elections. We have our own elections every 4 years, where we can elect our own government and other representatives, including a resident commissioner who has voice but no vote in the U.S. Congress. Puerto Ricans have authority over some internal affairs, but currency, defense, external relations, communications, the postal service, social security, and interstate commerce are within the jurisdiction of the federal government, the U.S. federal government. Both Spanish and English are recognized as official languages, but Spanish is by far the dominant spoken language. My native language is Spanish. Puerto Rico is not the only place where one can find such a conflicted political situation. My friend anthropologist Yariman Bonilla has coined the term non-sovereign Caribbean to identify the multiplicity of territories, departments, protectorates, municipalities, commonwealths that are actually the norm in the Caribbean, and that lie outside of the traditional definitions of either independent states or official colonies. She describes the predicaments of inhabitants of these non-sovereign island countries as strategic entanglements, because while people reject formal colonialism, they also reject and do not believe in the creation of independent states as a solution to the problem. So in Puerto Rico, more than a century after U.S. invasion, an overwhelming majority wishes to preserve ties on some level or other to the U.S. and to preserve U.S. citizenship. At the same time, academic, political, and popular opinions overwhelmingly indicate that Puerto Ricans view themselves as a distinct national group with a common history, culture, and heritage that is different from that of the U.S. Now, this distinctiveness vis-a-vis the U.S. is not only constructed culturally or in terms of language, but it's also constructed racially. For example, you see images of this racial triad, and as in Brazil, the Dominican Republic, Cuba, Colombia, and other sides of what one might call Afro-Latin America, dominant renditions represent Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans as the product of the mixture between the indigenous, Taino, Europeans, and African heritages. Okay? Now, in my recent book, Scripts of Blackness, I pay particular attention to the ways in which that African component of the mixture is recognized, celebrated, acknowledged by the government and by dominant narratives. So, although it is important to also recognize that the African heritage can be often silenced or ignored, I think one should also pay attention to the terms in which, when the government does recognize it, because it's part of this narrative of mixture, in what terms does it recognize it, you know? Now, I argue that national discourses that exalt African heritage do so by circumscribing its influence, often to particular places of communities that are considered folkloric and that are often cast as traditional remnants of a past era, supposedly unaffected by modernization and its byproduct, blanqueamiento. Such celebratory renderings of Black communities reinforce what I previously referred to as this very constrained and narrow definition of Blackness. One can also find similar representations in larger Black sites throughout Latin America, such as Bahia in Brazil, Oriente in Cuba, El Chocó in Colombia, or the town of Loíza in Puerto Rico, where Blackness is presented as a self-evident and geographically contained category. I believe such constructions are problematic, especially in the Caribbean, because in circumscribing Blackness to a place, they convey the sense that Blackness is exceptional or different from the rest of the nation. Thus, while these Black places and its inhabitants are marked and sometimes celebrated for their cultural traditions or cultural distinctiveness, the broader national context in which they are positioned remains unmarked and implicitly represented as not Black, or as 76% white in a Hispanic sense. Okay. My ethnographic exploration of these issues took me to the barrio of San Antonio in Puerto Rico, in the town of Ponce. This is a working class community constituted by approximately 300 families located in the town of Ponce. And this is a map of Puerto Rico up here in the corner, and this is where Ponce is in the southern part of the island. And this is a map of Ponce. This is where the green is where you see the historical zone or the main plaza, you know, like all those plazas that the Spanish built with the church, you know, and the mayor's office, etc. And then San Antonio is here, and in this sector, it used to be this whole sector, but now it's just this area here marked in purple. San Antonio figures prominently in popular discourses and references made to Puerto Rico's African heritage and culture. In Ponce, San Antonio is well known as the birthplace of famous artists, musicians, and athletes. The community, however, is best known in Puerto Rico for its rumba and plena, music genres that constitute the most explicit, celebrated link to the island's African presence. This is a picture of a bomba playing a dancer's dress in a performance, in a public performance. The community in San Antonio is also marked racially, phenotypically speaking. And during my field work, I often heard people talk about San Antonio as the black community of Ponce. I think that was the only people. One man whom I interviewed in Ponce's Plaza even considers San Antonio to be the only place where you could find black people in Puerto Rico. Puerto Ricans aren't colored, he said. We're 80% white. Where do you find blacks? In San Antonio is the only place, he said. San Antonio's status as a site of Afro-Puerto Rican folklore was also actively sustained and promoted during the time of my fieldwork through festivals, ceremonies, and events organized by a select group of community members in coordination with different government agencies, such as the tourist section of the municipality. The most prominent of those initiatives, of those government-sponsored initiatives to celebrate the African heritage of this community, was a housing project that the local government of the city of Ponce developed during the late 1990s. And as you see, it says the Autonomous Municipality of Ponce, this is the project of rehabilitating the historic zone of San Antonio. And then the name of the mayor in very big red letters. The neighborhood project sought to improve housing conditions for residents, but also aimed to pay tribute to the barrio's African heritage and cultural contributions. During a visit to the community, the mayor said the following, and I'm going to read it in Spanish, but you can follow the translation in English here. He said, Ponce tiene unos símbolos que significan mucho para Ponce, pero no solo para Ponce, para Puerto Rico, inclusive para el mundo, porque en esta tierra donde yo estoy parado hoy, él estaba en San Antonio, aquí los africanos aportaron lo que tenían a nuestra raza, y nuestra raza no es otra cosa que la mezcla del africano, el español y el indio taíno, y de ahí sale la raza puertorriqueña. Nosotros teníamos que de alguna manera reciprocar lo que San Antón ha significado para la historia de nuestro país y de nuestra ciudad. End of quote. Now, despite all these well-intentioned motives, the government never asked residents what type of housing they prefer. And as it turned out, their intent of preserving the community's traditions through the housing project did not necessarily correspond with residents' expectations or understanding of their community. A few residents saw in the government's rehabilitation plan the opportunity of preserving family clusters and traditional wooden houses, but for many others, San Anton was a community whose houses should be rebuilt in cement and developed according to modern standards of living. And there's a relationship in the Caribbean between cement and modernization. When the project was finally implemented, conflict over the lack of information about land distribution, objection to the small size of the new houses, and the fact that they were made out of wood, spurred a public controversy and an active protest on the part of the residents there. The controversy also took on a strong political tone because construction works began during an election year in 1996, amidst an electoral climate of rivalry between the two main political parties, which are these two parties. The Commonwealth Party, which was the red, as you saw in the sign of San Anton's housing project. This was the party in power in Ponce, specifically. The mayor was of this party, who sort of supports the status quo, but with enhanced political powers for Puerto Rico. Then the rival party is the pro-statehood party, who argues that they want to see Puerto Rico become a state of the U.S. It doesn't matter which party wins the elections, because at the end, it's not up to us to decide, it's up to the US Congress. But these are the ideological projects that these two parties uphold. Since the housing project in San Antonio was developed by a municipal administration that did not favor statehood, the Red Party, the housing project in San Antonio materialized as an indicator of that party's defense of Puerto Rican traditions, or of Afro-Puerto Rican traditions in this place, vis-a-vis the agenda of North American assimilation proposed by the rival statehood party, the Blue Party. Okay? Now, in the process of exalting San Antonio's it got to me in the process of exalting San Antonio's historical roots and traditions, government officials rarely mention the history of slavery specifically, and this should come as no surprise, since slavery is a thorny, problematic topic for nationalism, or even cultural nationalism, and one politicians would not want to bring up during an election campaign. Nevertheless, the housing project did receive a fair amount of press coverage, and other sources like newspaper articles, local newsletters, and newscasts did address the history of slavery in the process of describing the community. An article published in one of the major newspapers at the time explained, for example, the following. La comunidad de San Antón se organiza por grupos de esclavos que llegaron a Ponce de la mano, by the hand, de colonos extranjeros. Estos, atraídos por los incentivos de la cédula de gracia promulgada en el 1815 por la corona española, llegaron a Ponce aportando en gran medida al desarrollo económico del poblado. Y con ellos también llegaron grandes comunidades de esclavos. Con la abolición de la esclavitud promulgada en el 1872, it's actually in 1873, se dio una transición de labor esclava a una asalariada. La mayoría de los esclavos fueron desalojados de sus plantaciones y pasaron a ocupar terrenos sin uso, ya bien cercanos a las plantaciones mismas o a los poblados. Así San Antón creció hasta convertirse en uno de los mayores asentamientos de esclavos libertos de Ponce. Now, in this and other versions, San Antón is described as a community of slaves who settled there after slavery was abolished. However, colonial census documents that I investigated during my research indicate that there was already a sizable population of free, skilled laborers who lived there during the slavery period. In fact, when one compares San Antón population figures for 1880 to other values, we see that San Antón had the second largest concentration of free people of color in all of Ponce. Those classified as white formed the second largest group in the sector, and slaves the third group. Population figures in San Antón did increase after the abolition of slavery, but much more drastic increments in population can be noted before the abolition of slavery, between, say, 1841 and 1868. Okay, in this period, we see an increment. So it's really not correct to say that this community was established after the abolition of slavery. Despite the relative accessibility of this information at the archives, the importance of this large sector of free people of color was silenced or simplified by a script that invalidated the impact of free people of color and white peasants in the area, highlighting instead the presence of slaves. This script disregards the role that free people of color played in San Antón during the slavery period, denying agency to those slaves who managed to buy their freedom before the abolition of slavery, while also effacing the efforts of those black artisans who strove to find alternative sources of livelihood within enslaved society. So a key question here is, why does this happen, right? Why are free people of color and white peasants erased from the barrio's history? Before answering that question, let me just say that this history is not unique to San Antonio. As it happens, Puerto Rico had a very vast sector of free people of color before formal emancipation in 1873. Now, if you look at this graph, the free people of color sector between 1775 and 1860, these were years of heightened production in the cane industry. The free people of color sector, that is free blacks and mulattoes, is marked by the bar that has stripes. According to colonial census, this is the sector, the white sector, by the white bar, and the black bar is what marks the percentage of enslaved individuals. Okay, so you see that the free people of color sector is quite numerous in the island compared to the enslaved sector. And if you add the enslaved sector and the free people of color sector, it surpasses the white sector. Now, in this sense, San Antonio, being a community established by free people of color, is not an exception, but actually an emblematic case of a broader historical trend in Puerto Rico. The prevalence of this sector of free people of color on the island was partly due to the fact that the economic expansion of the sugar industry in Puerto Rico was slow, highly uneven, and very tardy in comparison to other English colonies, such as Jamaica. Ups and downs in the economy meant that the planter class could not always retain their slaves. The slave population in Puerto Rico was therefore small when compared to other islands of the non-Hispanic Caribbean. In Jamaica, for example, slaves formed about 90% of the total population before the time of emancipation. In Puerto Rico, the slave population never rose above 15% of the total population. This irregular development of the plantation, the institutional arrangements by which enslaved could gain their freedom, and of course the practice of escaping the plantation, contributed to the growth of a substantial population of free people of color in Puerto Rico. In addition, the Spanish crown offered slaves who fled from neighboring English and Danish colonies freedom if they conveyed to the Catholic faith, and this was a way to dwarf, their opponents, the other metropolitan powers in the area of the Caribbean. As a result, the percentage of Puerto Rico's free people of color dwarfed those of Jamaica, Barbados, and the United States, and to a lesser degree, Cuba. Now, in spite of the considerable size of the sector and importance for Puerto Rico, free people of color are seldom mentioned in dominant interpretations of Puerto Rican history. School textbooks, for example, focus on the indigenous Tainos, the Spaniards, the African slaves as the three foundational groups, and simply do not mention free people of color at all. Furthermore, traditional historiography has either overlooked this non-white sector or argued that this was a mixed race group that contributed to the blurring of racial differences in Puerto Rico. Jorge Duani, for example, says that the significance, and I quote, of the free color sector is that it was the first to contradict the established social order, based on the separation between the European and African segments. This mixed group served to bind the social fabric together by forming a buffer zone between blacks and whites, masters and slaves. So in this way, you see free people of color are cast as mixed, while slaves are represented as the blacks, right? And this reduction of blackness to enslave and foreign African status then disregards free blacks who live and were born on the island during the slavery period. Okay? Now, such uses of the word negro, black, to mean slave can be traced to 19th century practices in Puerto Rico and in the DR that distinguish between a large free population who did not call themselves free blacks, called themselves mulattoes or pardos, and the less numerous slave population who were racialized as black by both whites and free people. Such collapsing of the category of black into the category of slave erases and simplifies the multi-layered positions of Africans and their descendants during the slave period. Furthermore, the equation of black equals slaves also reduces the category of blackness to that of enslavement, indirectly identifying anyone who is free as not black. Okay? Now, conversely, the representation of San Antonio as a community of ex-slaves reinforces its characterization as the black community of Ponce, obliterating the multi-layered relationships that must have existed there between free people of color, slaves, white peasants, and hacendados. I argue that to the extent that slavery is equated with blackness, this script then gains currency because it facilitates the public recognition of San Antonio as a place of racial uniqueness. Okay? Now, at the broader national level, beyond San Antonio, this discursive strategy of collapsing blackness and enslavement and disregarding free people of color is also linked to the ideological project of blanqueamiento. Once the equivalency between enslavement and blackness is established, claims made about Puerto Rico's small slave population could easily turn into claims about Puerto Rico's small black population. Okay? This correspondence enabled historians to argue that Puerto Rico was undergoing a rapid process of whitening or blanqueamiento. For example, consider this article published in 1995 to commemorate the abolition of slavery. This was in one of the leading newspapers of Puerto Rico, and the article begins as follows: commemoration. Puerto Ricans will bleach away many of the physical traces of its African past by the year 2200, with the other Spanish-speaking Caribbean following a few centuries later. Puerto Ricans are whitening, blanqueando, faster than any other mestizo hybrid country, said historian Luis Diaz Soler, a specialist on island slavery. In 2 centuries, there will be hardly any blacks in Puerto Rico. End of. Besides ignoring the growing impact of immigration from nearby Caribbean islands, the article conveniently overlooked people of African descent who were legally free during slavery. According to the article, Puerto Rico had the smoothest transition from slavery to emancipation of almost any American country because of 2 factors. 1, a small population of blacks, by this he meant slaves, and 2, the tolerance of white Spaniards towards intermarriage. Now, this argument about the tolerance of Spaniards has a history, so I'll tell you a little bit about that. The representations of Spaniards as tolerant, benevolent colonizers became particularly prevalent in the 1930s and 40s among an educated elite in Puerto Rico who rejected the colonizing impact of the U.S. in the island. The island had been occupied by U.S. military since 1898, as I said, but the economic and social effects of that regime, of that colonial regime, made themselves particularly evident during the repression in the 1930s. And so it impacted the island in terms of high unemployment rates, low wages, exploitative working conditions, and dispossessed Creole hacendados whose tobacco, sugar, and coffee industries had flourished under the previous Spanish regime, viewed with resentment the political and economic stronghold of U.S. sugar corporations in the island. And so many intellectuals from that generation of the 1930s wrote as the heirs of a threatened culture whose origins they located in Spain. Okay? And at the same time, nationalism was linked to Europe. The movements of nationalism, the concept of nationalism was linked to Europe. And this in turn linked the notion of Europe and of whiteness to projects of self-government in the island. So the invocation of Spain became a powerful source of civilizing strength to legitimize self-government against the colonizing influence of the U.S. Claims to a Spanish heritage also served to distinguish Puerto Ricans from the North American other, Hispanic whiteness, not Anglo whiteness, thus became the marker of civilization and the proof for the capacity of self-government for this Creole elite. Now, in this context, arguments made about Spain's benevolent slavery and the resulting effect of a harmonious and whitened society served to uphold anti-colonial efforts and demands for self-government. Following a similar trend to that of other Brazilian intellectuals of the 30s and 40s, intellectuals in Puerto Rico argue that because Spaniards were more inclined to mixing, this fostered greater social harmony and also promoted the cultural assimilation of blacks into Hispanic culture as well as biological blanqueamiento. Critical of these interpretations, Puerto Rican researchers and historians have begun to develop alternative approaches, especially in the 1970s. There were many different alternative historiographies developed during that time, historians wrote about slave rebellions, complaints that slaves lodged against their owners, to debunk this idea of benevolent slavery and harmonious Spanish colonialism. And they also talked about the importance of the free black population. This new cadre of historians also challenged previous interpretations of slavery and of the plantation economy as an accidental aspect of the Puerto Rican economy. But despite these and other challenges, historian renditions of slavery as unimportant ideas about blanqueamiento, Spanish benevolence, and slave docility are still prevalent in contemporary national and racial discourses in the island. As I said, you can find these discourses still today in school textbooks. And consider, for example, this is the only monument we have in Puerto Rico that is dedicated to the abolition of slavery. It's in Ponce. And the ex-slave is shown as kneeling down. And when you contrast it to other monuments across the Caribbean that also celebrate emancipation, it's very different, such as the Emancipation Statue in Barbado, this monument, Yanda Monument in Mexico, the Mola de Solitud in Guadalupe, Zumbe, Los Palmares in Brazil, and this is what we have in Portugal. Now, San Anton's characterization as a barrio of slaves who came by the hand of hacendados and settled there after they were granted freedom corresponds with such dominant scripts of benevolent slavery. Now, in the case of San Anton, however, blanqueamiento, you see, is supported not by extending Puerto Rican claims to Hispanic whiteness, but by representing the community as an exception. Thus, while notions of race mixture and blanqueamiento are emphasized for Puerto Rico as a whole, San Anton is essentialized and the community links to slavery are simplified. While race mixture is declared emblematic for the nation, San Anton's inhabitants are casted as just black. While slavery is declared unimportant at a national level, in San Anton, historical antecedents can only be about slavery. My criticism of those scripts does not seek to extend notions of blanqueamiento to San Anton. That's not what I'm arguing. But rather, I aim to question the rationale that establishes that it is only in San Anton where slavery mattered, and that when it mattered, its effects upon the community adopted such essentialized forms. Furthermore, this rendition had little or no correspondence with residents' own understanding of their culture. When I interviewed all the residents about the barrio's history, their stories were predominantly informed not by bomba and plena, or even slavery, but by personal narratives that address issues of land tenure, kingship ties, and work in the cane industry, which was the major economic industry in the region. Also, such stories were told as personal narratives, not as a general shared rendition that was part of the collective memory. There was no mention of the community being established after or before the abolition of slavery. Slavery was just not a thing. In fact, none of the stories old people told me about San Antonio began with the subject of slavery, its abolition, or the process of settlement that supposedly followed after emancipation. Rather, what came across in many narratives was the fact that the land was already theirs. Furthermore, when speaking about the community history in general, people spoke of changes in the landscape. This was here before. Before you didn't see these houses here, there was a tree here, or there was, this vast area here reserved for such and such purposes. So they talked about how properties were attained, sold, bought, and transformed. In that sense, knowing about the community history did not have to do with the practices of origins as much as it had to do with the practices of change, of knowing how the community had changed. When I pressed for answers about origins, older residents told me they did not know exactly when, but that I should go to the archives or to the museums if I wanted to look for answers. I kept pressing. The only time I heard an origin story from residents was during a stage performance that a theater group from the community presented to voice their distrust towards the government's housing initiative. The performance took place the day before the construction works of the housing project began, in front of community residents and government officials. And this happened just prior to the opening of the ceremony, in which the mayor would explain the details of the housing project to the residents. The project had been announced in newspapers and speeches, but no formal orientation had been provided to residents prior to that moment. And the construction works were to begin the next day. Right? Now, the play is particularly interesting because it told the historical origins of San Antonio in ways that challenged the government, but also reproduced the erasure of people of color. And I'll show you, I'll tell you a little bit about how that went. So, on one side of the stage, and this is in the community basketball court, the theater group, which was led by a teacher and by about 10 other youths in the community, they placed a representation of a new house, which is this white structure, and on the other side, a representation of a traditional San Antonio structure that was marked by that what's written there, it says Colmado La Buena Fe, the good faith store, and it had candles, a black doll, plants, and some effects like a quinqué, and other items that made reference to Santeria, the religion of Santeria. There are also panderos, which is a typical instrument used in the plena, in the music, and of course, then the new San Antonio, in contrast, was represented by a regular plain and less decorated house painted. Now, the performance began with Evelyn, a tall 19-year-old with amazing stage presence and voice projection. She walked slowly in front of the audience, in front of government officials, wearing an elegant short dress and holding a microphone with one hand and the other one placed on her hip. Her monologue began as follows. Y hablando de casas, cosa muy a tono con la ocasión, el taller La Brisa se complace en presentarles a todos ustedes unas breves estampas de nuestro barrio. Pero primero queremos que conozcan un poquito de nuestra historia. Evelyn talked about the religious origins of the name San Antón and also mentioned some of the haciendas that had prevailed in the region during the early part of the 19th century. Then she continued. Como ustedes sabrán, los que la tenían que trabajar eran los esclavos. ¡Qué mamea! Later she continued. Bueno, ustedes se preguntarán que cómo llegamos nosotros aquí. Bueno, pasaron los años y llegó la mecanización de la isla, las haciendas. Y lógico, ya los esclavos no tenían que trabajar, no era tan necesario. Y así que, ¡chas!, llegó la abolición de la esclavitud. ¡Qué trabajo! ¡Qué malo esto para los dueños de los esclavos! Ahora tenían que dejar a todos esos esclavos libres. ¿Sí? Libres, como eran antes allá en África. Entonces llegó una enmienda del gobierno que le exigió a todos los dueños de la hacienda alojar a todos esos esclavos. Pero miren, libres. Entonces los dueños de las haciendas, la Constancia y la Estrella, compraron, miren, estas tierras. Sí, las de San Antón. Y dice que no las regalaron. Miren, no nos las regalaron nada. Nos la ganamos con nuestro sudor, nuestra sangre y nuestras lágrimas. And then the audience applauded and shouted there when she said, no nos la regalaron nada, gente. Nosotros hicimos desde Ponce señorial con nuestro trabajo. And there, another round of applause. Claro que sí. No nos la regalaron nada. And then the girl shouted, ya. Pero mija, hay que contarlo, responde Evelyn. And everybody laughed. Entonces la gente se fue levantando el sector más bravo de todo el canto. Negros nada más. And the audience applauded again. Pobres pero sabrosos. The performance ended shortly afterwards with a group of children singing and dancing to the rhythm of the plena. With panderos, maracas in hand, they moved from the old towards the other side where the new house was. As the girls danced, everyone in the troupe sang the plena, this plena, that said, no quieren y que sacar por la canalización de este barrio famoso que se llama San Antón. Now this plena, composed by the local music group Los Guayacanes, was used during the 70s to protest the government expropriation of land from residents to channel a river that borders the community. And at that time, many residents were forced to move out of the community. That's why I said San Antonio is now only like that purple triangle there, because before that it was a much vaster section. Now, although the plena was created to address the issues of a different time, the basic players were the same ones involved now. The government and the people of San Anton expressing their will to endure. So, as the mayor was preparing to offer new housing to the community, Taller La Sombra responded with a plena that spoke of a previous initiative that took away housing on it. The plena song Then and Now thus conveyed a message of suspicion towards government interventions and their good faith with the community. Furthermore, Taller La Sombra's rendition of San Anton history also questioned the well-intentioned motives of the government. Their statement that we made this aristocratic Ponce with our work implies that if it weren't for the work of people of San Anton, those in power could not enjoy the privileged position as givers. Their insistence on the fact that San Anton is there, not because hacendados gave them away, but because they earned it, further undermine the government's proclaimed intentions of giving housing to the community. Moreover, by proclaiming that hacendados didn't give us anything, we earned it with our sweat and blood. The play also challenged the notion that San Anton's origins began with an act of benevolent generosity on the part of hacendados. The history that Taller La Sombra told at the ceremony certainly certainly challenged the government's so-called benevolence, but it also reproduced some elements of the dominant post-abolition story that I'm critiquing as well. As it were, San Anton's large free people of color sector, the free blacks and mulattoes, were effaced in both dominant and residents' renditions of the barrio's past, including Taller Las Sombras performance. The silence can be interpreted as the effects of powerful scripts as embedded in schools, monuments, museums, and other media that have made such alternative narratives simply unavailable. When I say unavailable, I don't mean to say that the information is unavailable at the archives, but that it has not been incorporated into a story that is well known, shared, or celebrated. In that sense, it is a past that people in San Antonio did not know existed even when their ancestors experienced it. Writing on the issue of historical production, Michael Godreau has noted that the past is always a position. What makes one story better than another is not necessarily empirical exactitude, but the relationship between the information and the circumstances, political, moral, ethical, of the present. In this sense, unearthing an alternative history not only requires producing new facts, but also the extra labor of creating a new narrative and context in which that story can find significance. An alternative script, if you will. In the words of Trujillo, the unearthing of silences and the historian's subsequent emphasis on the retrospective significance of hitherto neglected events requires not only extra labor at the archives, whether or not one uses primary resources, but also a project linked to an interpretation. In the case of San Antonio, when that alternative interpretation is not available, the void is then filled by well-known post-abolition script that renders free people of color invisible and reproduces racial exceptionalism in San Antonio. However, Taller Las Sombras' performance also illustrates that while scripts are mediated by the state and by powerful actors, people can also use them in unexpected contexts to challenge a dominant rhetoric. In that process, people can also question one script while reproducing or accommodating to another. The key issue here is not so much whether the script is accurate, but what social work is that particular racial script doing for the people who tell it. Authenticity, according to Trujillo, always resides in the struggles of our present, in the current practices that engage us as witnesses, actors, and commentators. So it is in the overlap between how history works and how it is produced that we can begin to discover differential exercises of power that make some narratives possible and silence others. Hence, although many residents rejected the characterization of San Antonio's viuda community of Ponce and did not consider slavery as a reference point in their narrative when I interviewed them, at that time, right there and then, in front of the government officials, Taller La Sombra highlighted the history of slavery and used racial exceptionalism to their advantage to tell the mayor and his white-collar architects and urban planners, we are here, this place is ours, we are black, don't mess with us, right? And residents in the audience, old and young, cheered enthusiastically. The government should have paid attention to the warning because once construction works began and residents saw that this was not the project they had hoped for, they organized, denounced the government in front of TV and radio stations, sought legal advice, and organized a march to the mayor's office. Finally, the government had to alter part of the original housing plan, and only those residents who wished to move, those were the ones who moved to the housing facility. So now, if you go to San Antonio, you see that there's a sector where you see the houses that the new government built, and then there's another area where the houses are as they were more or less when I was doing field work there. When I asked the director of the regional planning office why his office did not consult further with the community, he said that there was little consensus among residents on the matter of how their community should be rehabilitated. Besides what he called poca visión común, very little common vision, he added that there was also little faith in the true purpose of a government entity. They don't believe, he said, they don't trust in empowerment. Apart from the fact that one could hardly call empowerment a process that is based on the expectations that residents of San Antonio follow the government's lead, this additional expectation of this government bureaucrat, that the people of San Antonio should speak as one, also needs to be called into question. This requirement for uniformity and spontaneous consensus also resonates with a politics of cultural nationalism that has trivialized and simplified the heterogeneous experiences of blacks and mulattoes during and after the slavery period. So to conclude, I have argued that the inclusion of the African heritage in national narratives about Puerto Rico, other sides of Afro-Latin America, rests on discourses that make Hispanicity normative, cast whiteness as flexible and expansive, but bound blackness to very particular characteristics and spaces. I then argue that the erasure of free people of color contributes to this narrative because it helps to circumscribe blackness to enslavement, thereby recasting anyone who is not slave as not black. Since enslaved individuals did not constitute a large population sector in Puerto Rico, this discursive maneuver, combined with the idea of benevolent slavery, served to uphold the argument that Puerto Ricans have whitened through mixture. In San Antonio, this same script worked in an opposite, albeit connected direction, by recasting the folklore community as one of ex-slaves where only black people live. Such scripts of racial exceptionalism thus work to establish Hispanic whiteness as a rule. However, people are not mere automatons or victims of these scripts. I also argue that subaltern expressions and alternative propositions about race, class, and power can take place alongside official renderings of blackness. In that process, mobilizing the history of slavery, even if that history is incomplete, can become an important strategy for challenging racial hierarchies. This does not require that people resist the dominant script in some romanticized or coherent fashion. The important issue at hand is, as Trujillo states, the particular power dynamics that inform the context of the historical narration. That is the relationship between the script and the political, moral, ethical circumstances of the present. With this tenet in mind, and considering the enduring effects of racism in the Americas, the task of constructing alternative narratives that offer more liberating, anti-racist, and just possibilities seems to me to be urgent. Imagining a future in which African heritage and its legacy is not conceived as a few scattered hotspots, and where the contemporary effects of slavery and colonialism can be narrated as part of la nacional, as part of that which is national, is important. In these alternative narratives, slave resistance, the agency of free people of color, their resilience, and wide-ranging efforts at surviving a racist society would be told as part of a national story, widely available, especially to those who are impacted most directly by racial inequality and the economic effects of modern-day colonialism. This is, of course, no small challenge. However, if so many free blacks and mulattoes living under the system of slavery figure out how to buy their freedom, help their king, acquire land, grow their food, and then be so threatening as to get erased from dominant nationalist narratives, I think we could also find a way. Thank you.
I'd like to take some questions from the audience, for folks who have some. Do you think that the people living in the house in Blackness feels like the government are proceeding differently among their community?
That's a really good question. I just visited there about 2 weeks ago. They were celebrating the birthday of one of the older residents that I interviewed, who's now 100 years old. And the people who came to the celebration, they closed. She lives in one of the new houses. Actually, I have some pictures here of the houses. This is how the community looked like when I got there. And the houses, this is the houses, the new houses. So they closed the street for the celebration. And people from both this side of the community and the other side that has not been affected came. And really, I don't think they are looked at differently. The decision to move into the housing project was made by families who did not own land, okay? And the government did try to convince one family who owned a big piece of land to move into the housing project. And after the family did that, they regretted it. But people understand that. I mean, there's no, I don't perceive there's any differences. I mean, people in the community understood why people who chose to move. And they still talk about it as San Antonio, as a community. Yeah.
So I'm Puerto Rican, and I've never been to Puerto Rico, and I was wondering if there are any pockets of Taino communities, because growing up, in a Puerto Rican community in New York City, the way you self-conceptualize is like you said, Taino, African, and then Spaniard. But I always wondered if there were any pockets of like Taino community.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Actually, what happens is that the Taino legacy is very romanticized in Puerto Rico. And to my knowledge, there are no pockets of indigenous communities in Puerto Rico. However, there is a neo-Taino movement, okay? And this is people who are trying to rescue their Taino heritage and trying to recreate ceremonies, etc. And mostly in performances, etc. I am somewhat critical of the movement because I think it often, people can often celebrate their Taino heritage, but in the process forget about the African heritage. And it can be a way to sort of Indianize African heritage, However, on the other hand, I think the movement is really interesting because it does poses challenges to the colonialism, even Spanish colonialism or U.S. colonialism. Okay, and they're very critical. They're not into Hispanophilia or this love for Spanish, because one way of resisting the U.S. colonialism was to exalt Spanish colonialism, but Tainos won't do that, right? So they are very critical of Spanish colonialism and of U.S. colonialism, and it's a way to sort of reaffirm political autonomy and rootedness in the island, etc. But they have issues. The issue with how do you integrate African heritage into that is problematic. And so you have instances, for example, of people with, curly hair that are forced to wear wigs, with straight hair so that they look Taino, and that kind of. And so there's the Taino look. Some groups, have specifics. It gets complicated, but it's there. Actually, they're very active in New York. They're more active in New York than in India, which is interesting as well. Yes?
How would you say the experiences of the Black people that live in Puerto Rico, not in communities with Black people, are compared to communities?
are compared to the experience of people who live in these like marked communities? It's a good question. I haven't done research on that specifically, but in Puerto Rico, this housing project is kind of like, it's not that many housing projects like this take place, okay? But however, in Colombia or in Brazil, there has been actual legislation to protect lands that are assigned to maroon communities, you know? And so in those cases, those communities have to prove that they have, you know, a direct link with maroon ancestors, okay? And sometimes they call on anthropologists to legitimate, you know, that they have their costumes, etc., and their traditions, and so they can then earn rights to collective land entitlements. And this is something officialized by the government. And so what happens is that for Black people who are not living in those communities or are not considered traditional enough, you know, then somehow the legislation doesn't quite solve the problem, because what they're really looking at is cultural distinctiveness. They're not dealing with racism. They're not dealing with racial discrimination. They are really assuming like a multicultural discourse of, you know, cultural heritage and cultural diversity, similar to what has happened with indigenous communities in Latin America, that are, you know, separated into these areas or specific protectorates. But if you approach the issue from that angle of cultural distinctiveness, you miss out on the issue of racism and how to tackle the racial and the institutional racism that people, Black people, regardless of whether they live in these communities or not, could be subject to. In Puerto Rico, I think, I don't know, I don't know if there's, I know there are people, Puerto Ricans, Black Puerto Ricans who come to San Antonio to come to the festivals, you know, etc. I think there's a desire to also claim modernity, you know, since Puerto Rico's African heritage seems to be only legitimized as something of the past, you know, as bomba and plena, as, you know, traditions. That's when African heritage is exalted. But when you talk about modern Blackness, you know, how can you be Black and modern and a businessman or sing rap, you know, not bomba and plena, but rap or, you know, any other merengue or any other, then that's seen as like contamination, like we're becoming Americanized or Dominicanized, or, you know, the way to be truly authentic Puerto Ricans to do these traditional things. And so it can become conflicted. I have to do more research to answer the question. Yes.
Do people in San Antonio actually use the word negro without el diminutivo negrito? Or, like, because like in the article when they say negro, they might say like indio oscuro or indio claro, which is like sort of going back to the whole Taino inheritance thing.
Yeah.
So it's like,
Or trigueño.
yeah,
Yeah. It depends. Again, like some people do, others don't. The community that function as sort of gatekeepers for me that I first met were communities that were linked to the government activities and festivals, and etc. They were very proud of being Black, and they refused to be called trigueño or trigueñito or negrito. You know, they assumed an identity as negros and were very proud of it. But other people did not, and other people actually, in fact, felt. I talked to an older woman who said that she felt that was an insult to call her Black. And then we continued talking, and then she later said, Well, it's really an insult because that reporter came here to say that we are a community of blacks. But, if my niece tells me I'm black, or, my family tells, then that's also un orgullo. I'm proud of that. So it depends who says it, basically, in an internal community context, if it's your neighbor and if in particular situations, then you can express black pride. But if a reporter, with her business attires and her microphone comes and says it's a community of blacks, that she would do. So it really depends who says it in what context. You had a question?
Yeah, I'm an anthropology major,
Mm-hmm.
and I was wondering if you could talk more about your field work and your role in between the locals and the government officials.
Yeah. Yeah, that was a hard thing to negotiate. Especially because to document the housing project, I needed access to government documentation. And I also wanted to give the community access to government documentation. And the government at some point was just telling people in San Antonio, for example, things that were just not necessarily true. Like they had to have a legal document proving their land ownership, and if they didn't, they needed to, move into the housing project. And luckily, my father specializes in property law, so I was able to, garner his support to orient people there during the process. But that meant that the government was not too happy with me at the time. But you keep insisting, and at the end they did grant me. Actually, I met the cousin of a person who worked at the office, and then she facilitated some of the documents, and I made copies, I made copies and then came back. So through networks, through meeting people, knowing people, and explaining them, and being straight about what you want to do, and then you can usually, it takes time, but I was there for a year and a half. Eventually.
So,
Yeah.
could you go back to explain trigueño, because some people here might not all
Right.
know the nuances of what that term means.
So yeah, in Afro-Latin America, or Brazil or Colombia, you have this plethora of different racial terminology. And the terminology is not the same in one country and another. So in Puerto Rico, we have this term that is very commonly used called trigueño. Now trigueño literally means from wheat, from trigo, coming from trigo, trigueño. But it doesn't really mean wheat because, I would be wheat colored, I guess. But trigueño is really used to name someone who is not white, not black, sort of someone in between, but it could also be used as an euphemism for black. So if you don't want to offend someone by calling them black, like this lady, she actually said to me, that reporter could have said, we are a community of trigueños, to be polite, right? That's what was her argument. But not to be so rude and say we're community of black. So, but at the same time, there are some people that don't have a problem with saying black, but want to distinguish between someone very dark skin and someone trigueño, right? So it really, to know who is meaning what in what moment, you have to have a lot of other information about what the story the person is telling you, who the person is, who you're talking to, how well you know the person. There are all these other facts that you need to gather before you can interpret the meaning of trigueño. And the same happens with other terms like indio, or sometimes people say, no, he's trigueño. So if they say it 3 times, they mean he's very dark skinned. So, it's very ambiguous terminology. And of course, all this terminology comes from, people trying to negotiate the stigma associated to Blackness and to the history of silver.
I wondered if the land ownership documents, so you say that some of the families have those documents themselves, but are there maybe documents in archives as well, and whether that gives any sense of this distinction between, I guess to go back to their script of that they were given this land after they became free versus your alternative script that there's something missing or not known about this community of people of color who already were free.
Yeah.
And whether land ownership is any way to negotiate that or navigate that.
Yes, and I did not have enough time or resources to do more research on that, because when I went to the archives, I did found that a lot of the heads of households listed in 19th century documents were actually women. And when I interviewed San Antonio residents, many of them told me that the person who had bought the land initially was a grandmother or a great-grandmother. So there's something happening there with women and land ownership. But I did not have, and I think it's something one could rescue from the historical record. And now, I'm an anthropologist who wants to be a historian. But at the time I didn't have, but it's a project that really, if any of you are interested.
Because it would seem to
be
that
a
the
great
date would
project
matter,
to-
right? If you have land ownership documents before the date of emancipation.
Yes, in census, what I did was look at census documents before the dates of emancipation and look at the households that were listed and the heads of households and which were owners of the house. So I could tell that there were women who owned houses there. And so I could, in that way I could sort of calculate, how many free people of color were in the community. But to look at the specific deeds, of the actual transactions of buying and land, etc., would be a great project.
Can we take one more question, Isar?
Yeah.
And then if people want to hang around and talk some more.
Sure,
Okay.
sure.
Great job. I remember you were speaking earlier about how the shape of languages differs in each country, and that can have a huge effect on how people are perceived or how they identify.
Mm-hmm.
And one difference or maybe commonality that I see in Latin America and the States here
Yeah.
is that language is often so scrutinized to the point where the phrases that we already have might be rejected. And here I know there are some groups of African Americans who reject Black as a label, and they favor terms like New African, and Mexican Americans might say Chicanos. And so I'm wondering about the term Afrodescendiente. That's something that I've been hearing a lot, especially with government agencies in New York, like in preparation for the next census cycle. A lot of them are considering using that instead of Black or Negro or Negro or Caribbean, etc. And considering that is connected to how the population in Puerto Rico is accounted for, I'm curious as to whether you've seen either all of those labels being rejected by any groups of people in Puerto Rico. Maybe people are just saying, we know we're proud of our African heritage, but we reject the label that was placed upon us, since in the African continent they did not have that concept of Blackness. Or if you see Afrodescendiente as like a catch-all being used.
Yeah, it's an excellent question, because sometimes these struggles and social movements sort of crystallize around specific terms, right? And then people struggle over the terms for different reasons. I think it always, because race is socially constructed and is a category that only has meaning because there's a racial hierarchy, right? If there was no racial hierarchy, we wouldn't be talking about race at all. It would be inconsequential. But because race doesn't exist, then race acquires social meaning. But then that means that it's very contextual, and that it always depends on why you want to use this term for what circumstances. So in Puerto Rico, different than in Brazil or in Colombia, where you see a much bigger movement of Afrodescendientes and of a Black affirmative movement, which has actually, their actual anti-racist legislation and this issue about, the Cimarrones communities, land struggles, etc., have been gained. In Puerto Rico, there's nothing like that, not even remotely. So people are still trying to rescue the term Black and be able to say, to affirm that identity without it having to be offensive or considered negative. Now with Afrodescendiente, that's only been recently acquired, and in fact, about 3 weeks ago in Puerto Rico, there was the first Congress of Afrodescendencia celebrated. And these type of congresses have been taking place in Colombia and Brazil and other places for a while now, but in Puerto Rico was the first one. So it tells you a little bit about the newness of the concept Afrodescendiente. And it's not a concept that is widely used among the population. It's interesting actually that here in the US, another concept that some people are trying to use is Afro-Latinos for census purposes. So I think it really depends on why you want to use this term, because for Afrodescendiente to me has the advantage that it's an inclusive category, that you can evoke it to talk about solidarity between Afrodescendientes in Puerto Rico, in Cuba, in the DR. It's an all-encompassing. It talks about a Black diaspora that is broader. At the same time, if you want to document institutional practices of racism in companies, for example, and you need to document whether a company is consistently hiring white people or lighter-skinned people and not hiring darker-skinned people, and they have an ethics about, sometimes in Puerto Rico, so you have to have good appearance, buena apariencia. What else does that mean? So that's a code word for trouble, in that company. So if you want to document whether buena apariencia is actually affecting the hiring practices of that company, you can't really use Afrodescendiente, because that's too broad. Everybody in Puerto Rico is Afrodescendiente, really. Everybody in the Caribbean. So you need more specific terms. So which terms are those going to be? So it really depends. The terms itself, to me, don't have any inherent value. It just depends on why you want to use them, for what purposes, why you want to challenge them, or why you want to, use this or not. And there should be flexibility. There should be, because racism and racial hierarchies acquire different forms, and you need different strategies to tackle it.
Thank you so much, Isar.